Okay, so just the basics, what is the scoping plan? This is the implementation plan to reach the goals of New York's Climate Act, which is the strongest or one of the strongest climate laws in the country. The sort of top line requirements of the act is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, so below 1990 levels. Just 8 years from now, and then achieving net zero emissions by 2050. It also requires that we generate 70% of our electricity from renewable resources by 2030 and achieve renewable fossil fuel-free electricity system by 2040. And very importantly, it requires that we ensure that our clean energy transition is just and equitable. And the law requires that we dedicate at least 35% of the benefits of clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities with a goal of 40%, though it should really, be even more than that. The scoping plan is very important because it's going to shape state legislation, regulation, and the decision-making of every state agency and department for years to come. The plan was developed by a 22-member Climate Action Council that was established under the climate law. It includes all of the heads of the relevant state departments and agencies, as well as 10 appointed members. They're a mix of environmental and climate justice advocates, industry representatives, and scientists. The work of this council was informed by the recommendations of 7 advisory panels that have expertise in the different areas, the different emission sectors, as well as the Climate Justice Working Group and the Just Transition Working Group, which were both created under the climate law. In addition to providing really important input into the recommendations of the plan itself, the Climate Justice Working Group is also responsible for developing the criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities who are to be the beneficiaries of the resources I mentioned before. That's actually a separate process with a separate public input. So there are going to be 6 other public hearings on the criteria, that their draft criteria, which has already been released. They've also produced a map. I'm not going to get into that today because we're focusing on the scoping plan, but it's also an extremely important process to weigh in on. So this pie chart is from the scoping plan, and it's based on the most up-to-date greenhouse gas emissions inventory for New York. So as you can see, buildings are responsible for the largest share, with transportation a close second. Together, they account for 60% of New York's emissions. Electricity accounts for 13%, but has an outsized importance because it is the linchpin of the clean energy transition, which is about electrifying everything. So meeting our goals is going to require truly transformational changes in every sector of the economy. This is just a snapshot of the kinds of changes that have to be made. This is according to an analysis done for the scoping plan called the integration analysis, and basically what it did is assess how far the recommendations of the Climate Action Council would take us in reaching our emissions reduction goals. So a few takeaways from that analysis is that by 2030, we need to electrify 1 to 2 million homes with heat pumps. We need to replace 3 million gas vehicles on the road with electric vehicles. By the way, we have, I think, around 45,000 zero emissions vehicles on the road, so that's a huge increase. We have to divert 100% of our organic waste from landfills and incinerators. And by 2040, fossil fuel plants, which account for about 43% of electricity generation statewide, must be fully retired and replaced primarily by wind and solar, together with battery storage. So, you're probably thinking like, wow, that's a lot of change in a very short amount of time. That's probably going to cost a lot. Interestingly, the analysis of the scoping plan found that the cost of, or maybe not, maybe it's obvious to you, but the cost of inaction would be far higher than the cost of policies to meet our energy goals by about $90 billion more. When you take into account the avoided health costs from fossil fuel pollution and avoided damages from climate change. The net costs of meeting our climate goals are also pretty small relative to the size of the economy, and that's because we would be replacing most of the equipment and goods that we need to replace at the end of their useful life. So those kinds of investments would be made anyway. It's about making the right choices at the time. So that's not to say that there are not upfront investments that have to be made, because there are significant upfront investments that need to be made. And that's actually a gap in this plan. It does not really talk about how all of this is going to be paid for. So it's a good thing to weigh in on. So the health benefits for New Yorkers alone would be tremendous because of the other pollutants from fossil fuels that we'll be eliminating that are absolutely debilitating to people's health, particularly in disadvantaged communities where polluting infrastructure is typically located. So this again is according to the integration analysis. We're expected to save between $50 to $120 billion from health improvements alone, and of course we'll have a much healthier population that will have a much better quality of life. The jobs benefits that would be created in New York for the clean energy transition are huge. And I think this is something that's really important to emphasize in public comments at the hearings, given the enormous pushback from building trade unions against the clean energy transition. This was a study that was done by the Just Transition Working Group, the job study, which is available on the state's climate website. But the study found that statewide there will be there's estimated to be almost 190,000 job net gain by 2030, which is tremendous. I don't historically know if that number of jobs has ever been created in such a short period of time, and a total of 268,000 jobs by 2050. These are decent paying jobs. The largest wage increase is in the middle wage range, which bucks the trend of a declining middle class over the last 50 years. And importantly, over half of these new jobs are in the building sector, because improving energy efficiency, electrifying our buildings, these are labor intensive industries. The ratio of jobs gained to jobs displaced is about 10 to 1, so it's enormous. But this is not to minimize the impacts of displaced jobs. It's a big focus of the climate law to ensure a just transition and putting the policies and programs in place that protect workers and their families and provide the resources and the training they need to shift to clean energy occupations. In the remaining time, I'm going to just highlight some recommendations in 4 sectors that together account for 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions in New York. There are some very important comments or recommendations to support in public comments. As I mentioned, buildings are the biggest source of emissions, about 1/3 of emissions. And eliminating those emissions are really the toughest nut to crack, because we have over 6.2 million buildings in New York that need to be electrified and made more efficient. Most of them were built before there were energy codes. One set of recommendations focuses on building codes and standards, including legislation that has been introduced called the Advanced Building Codes and Appliance Standards Act, the governor had actually proposed it in the state budget, and unfortunately it got kicked out in the end. But as the scoping plan states, advanced codes and appliance standards have to be passed in this legislation to keep us on track in meeting our emissions targets under the law. So there's still time, and hopefully we can get it passed this session, but it's important to advance, to really support this in comments. Another key recommendation of the scoping plan is all electric requirements for construction of new buildings, beginning in 2024 for most residential buildings, and then extended to new construction of all buildings by 2027. This is technically feasible, it's cost effective, new construction is the low-hanging fruit, and it's really important that, that this recommendation be supported. And the scoping plan, again, notes that this would have to be passed this year to go into effect in 2024. For existing buildings, the scoping plan recommends that by 2030, zero emissions standards should be in place for end-of-life replacement of fossil fuel heating and hot water equipment, with a 2035 date for large multifamily and commercial properties. Also by 2035, zero emissions standards are recommended for new appliances like dryers and stoves. Just to be clear, these are standards that they wouldn't require you to replace a working system. This is end-of-life replacements for new equipment only, new purchases only. So as we transition to electric technologies, we have to be transitioning off utility gas and oil for those who have it, but gas is what most New Yorkers currently use. This is a complex undertaking because it's tied to a wider utility-owned gas system. So the shift has to be carefully coordinated and cannot increase the burden on low and moderate income households. The scoping plan recommends that a couple of things happen as soon as possible. Critically, the laws that govern utility gas and electric service have to be made consistent with New York's climate law, eliminating utilities' obligation to serve gas, and supporting the transition to an equitable energy efficient electrification. Another key recommendation, seems like a total no-brainer, NYSERDA and utilities have to immediately stop promoting gas and ramp up marketing and incentives for heat pumps. It was great in this past budget, actually a $5,000 geothermal tax credit was passed as part of the budget. This is a step in the right direction, but we need a lot more support for that transition. And finally and importantly, the planning has to be done to transition to clean heating and cooling systems in a way that maintains affordable, safe, and reliable utility service. There was a bill introduced by Senator Liz Krueger called the Gas Transition and Affordable Energy or Affordability Act, Jessica? Affordable Energy Act. So this would provide a comprehensive, exactly the kind of comprehensive approach we need, the planning that we need, and it is something that's very important to advocate for in public comments. So no false solutions. In public comments, it's important to express support for the scoping plan's focus on efficient electrification to eliminate emissions and steer clear of those false solutions that are promoted by the fossil fuel industry and utilities. These include renewable natural gas and hydrogen for buildings. Finally, and critically, on the buildings front, the scoping plan has to include a firm commitment to at least $1 billion annually that is needed to support disadvantaged communities, low and moderate income households in transitioning to efficient electrified homes. This is what NYSERDA has estimated is minimally necessary. Okay, moving on to transportation. It's close second to buildings, accounting for 28% of emissions in New York. A big part of the solution here again is to electrify, though it's not all of the solution. We also have to expand public transportation as an option for folks, particularly outside of the big cities, and also make our communities more walkable and bikeable. So thanks to a bill that was introduced and signed into law last December, all sales of new cars in New York will be zero emissions starting in 2035. We have a gap though, because as I mentioned earlier, the analysis of the scoping plan says that we have to increase EVs on the road to about 3 million by 2030. And EVs are more expensive than gas-powered cars. So the only way to make it happen is through policies that affect pricing. In scoping plan comments, it's important to support a progressively structured fee base as recommended by the plan. This would be an additional fee on the purchase of fossil fuel-powered cars, gas-powered cars, to pay for incentives for EVs. It would also help to eliminate the sales tax on new and used EVs. And finally, we have to accelerate the build-out of fast charger network across the state. And also fix utility rates to encourage EV adoption and off-peak charging. So we also need to expand public transportation, and this, in my opinion, did not get enough of a focus. It got very little focus actually in the scoping plan. I think it would be valuable for people to share in public comments their own community's public transportation needs and priorities. Okay, so moving on to the electricity sector, we've been talking about the need to electrify buildings and transportation, but to be truly zero emissions, the grid itself has to be powered by clean, renewable energy. So we need to get to 100%, and we're currently at about 27%, and this is mostly legacy hydro. Only a small percentage is wind and solar, fossil accounts for about, as I had mentioned, about 43% of the state's resource mix. So we have a lot of work to do. And with electrification of other sectors, consumption of electricity is expected to increase by 80% by 2050. So that's a lot of wind and solar that we need to bring online. The good news is that we already have a renewable energy standard in place. And the Public Service Commission revised the standard so to meet our 2030 renewable target under the Climate Act. That standard requires utilities and energy supply companies to procure increasing amounts of renewable energy over time until we reach those targets. But those renewables have to get built. And a number of the scoping plan recommendations focus precisely on this issue of, accelerating the build out of these projects. We also need to greatly expand storage capacity, both to meet short duration needs, like when everyone is using power at the same time at home after work or school, as well as what's called long duration storage, or some resource that we can call upon when, say, we have like a bitter cold week in winter and everyone is running their heat pumps at full tilt and the sun isn't shining. So this is important when you have a renewable grid and has to be a real focus. So to meet our emissions goals, the scoping plan really needs to come down firmly on the side of prohibiting permitting new fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is a good point to emphasize in public comments. It's also important to support the plan's call for the State Department of Environmental Conservation to promulgate regulations to ensure a continual decline in emissions from power plants until we reach zero emissions in 2040. As recommended by the Climate Justice Working Group, the first plants that close should be those that disproportionately harm disadvantaged communities. There also have to be protections in place for communities affected by plant closure, including support for workforce transition, funding for localities to offset lost property tax revenue, and an enforceable requirement that the plant owner is responsible for site remediation. It's another important area of scoping plan recommendations to support. There's a recommendation to set annual megawatt targets for state permitting of renewables. So, and again, this is just to make sure that enough projects are getting permitted and constructed to meet our goals. And the same goes for battery storage. The plan actually, the scoping plan actually recommends expanding the clean energy standard or creating a separate storage standard, which is something that we really need so that we're building out enough storage for reliability purposes for our grid. Other important recommendations focus on supporting high-value renewable projects that contribute to equity, resilience, and smart land use, like expanding agrovoltaics, that's co-locating solar with agricultural production practices. The utilities also have to be required to better support renewables on the local grid, including expanding the capacity to interconnect your community solar, rooftop solar to the grid, and also to speed up the review of interconnection applications so that we can get more local projects on the grid more quickly. And there's a lot that needs to be done to better support local communities as partners in the clean energy transition, including mapping tools and resources to help them with their, first of all, proactively identify places in their communities to site solar. There's a lot of conflict over the siting of renewable energy, and also to streamline their permitting and zoning processes. Benefits should also be expanded to communities that host large-scale projects. And again, this will help reduce conflict with local communities over siting. Nationally, public sentiment is becoming less supportive of renewable siting, and we're seeing a lot of communities organize against it. So there has to be a real focus on education and on support for community engagement. Which brings me to this important point. The plan, this does not get enough attention in the scoping plan. Reaching our climate goals depends upon public support and engagement, and also on inspiring young people to pursue clean energy careers to make this transition happen. As I mentioned, it's going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs, but we have to have the people that want to pursue these careers. It would be great to really, express your support for a well-funded statewide public information and education campaign. We also need climate change curricula in our K-12 schools, and to begin encouraging kids from an early age to pursue clean energy careers. Work also has to begin immediately to recruit, train, and skill up the necessary workforce. The scoping plan is also could be bolstered in this area as well. Unless New York, begins now to develop this workforce, that trained workforce won't exist when we need them. So it's very important, and also, to include strong labor standards and protections across energy standards. Labor is a partner in this process and benefits from it. Okay, on the last sector that we're talking about today, the waste accounts for about 12% of emissions, although that's only end-use emissions, and it doesn't take into account the huge life cycle emissions of products and packaging. For those who are interested, we did a virtual teach-in with Judith Enck on this subject, and on the New Yorkers for Clean Power website, you can watch it. But we did kind of a deep dive into the waste recommendations. We don't really have time to review all of these recommendations, but the focus of them is on reducing waste altogether and ensuring that by 2030, no organic waste is landfilled or incinerated in New York. Edible food waste can be used to help feed the 1.5 million food insecure people in New York. And inedible waste can be composted and used to improve soil health, which is good for the climate and great for agricultural productivity as well. The scoping plan makes a number of recommendations around waste reduction, including enacting extended producer responsibility programs, by request only legislation to reduce single-use plastics, like, you're not handed a straw automatically, for instance, and requiring minimum levels of recycled content in products, among other measures. Okay, so that brings us to the end. You've already gotten the information about the Syracuse hearing, I also just want to note that it's great, again, to emphasize it's great to submit written comments. You can submit them right on the Climate Action Council's website through the portal. And we've produced some guides. New Yorkers for Clean Power has produced some guides to help with those more detailed comments as well. And I'll stop there.